Christmas isn't complete without a delicious turkey. This stunning bird will be the center of your family's holiday feast. It may look daunting, but if you follow my simple instructions, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3.
Take the turkey out! Listen,
Kelly, get out of there!
Get away! Get out!
Away! Kelly!
Take the
No! Wait!
Kelly, stop! Put it back!
Kelly!
Put the turkey out of there!
Open the door! Open the door!
Well, hopefully that's not what your Thanksgiving looked like. And not to be concerned, but that was not the Yonan family Christmas. Somebody saw that this week and thought that was the back of Rob's head there. It was not. It was actually a funny video that we got from North Point Community Church in Atlanta, where Andy Stanley is pastor, and they have a church network that we joined this year where it's an opportunity for us to connect with the broader church and to share resources, and so they provide us sermon resources. Well, each year we transition seemingly overnight from Thanksgiving to Christmas. One day we're eating leftovers and immediately moving into putting up Christmas trees, decorating the house, and almost without thinking. I mean, we just kind of have to flip the switch. We're buying gifts for our kids and for family. We're starting to plan family gatherings. And there's almost no time to stop and reflect on what Christmas is about. And so we want to ask the question, why do we celebrate Christmas? And really, who needs Christmas and what's the story about? Because it's easy to kind of just gloss over this story. And when you stop and think about it, there are some parts of the story that are almost unbelievable. Angels and stars, a virgin birth. But the truth is, the Christmas story doesn't begin with a young couple who's trying to figure out how and where they're going to have a baby. It doesn't begin with angels and shepherds. It actually begins with a couple who doesn't believe they're ever going to have a baby. The story starts with a promise that was made over 2,000 years before Jesus was born. Now, one of my favorite Christmas traditions was that my dad would read the Christmas story every morning, or on Christmas morning, before we did anything else. He would get his Bible out and he would read parts of the story from Matthew or Luke. And we've continued, Susie and I have continued that with our kids. It's just a fun tradition, and it's a good reminder of the story of Christmas. And even though there are 4 written accounts of the life of Jesus, or 4 Gospels, there's only 2 that address his birth. For instance, the Gospel of Mark just gets down to business. He immediately talks about Jesus' life and ministry because he believes, as I believe all the Gospel writers believe, that the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most important part of the story. And how he came into the world is secondary. And one of the things that I realized recently is every time we would read the Christmas story, my dad would actually skip the first 300 words or so of the story. And here they are from the Gospel of Matthew. And you'll see why we would skip these, because I wouldn't have been very excited about this, and my kids wouldn't have been very excited about this. It's just a list of names. It's a genealogy. Now, why are these here? Because they're not here by accident. There must have been something important, because back in the day when these stories and accounts were recorded, it was expensive to write. Scrolls were expensive. You most likely had to hire a scribe to do the recording. It's unlike today where we can publish words and put things on social media for free. So they had to go to a lot of trouble and thought. And the interesting thing, it's both in the Matthew account and the Luke account, though the genealogies are different. And I believe that they're here to remind the readers and to remind us of the backstory. To the first Jewish readers, though, these weren't just names, but they were stories. And as they read the names, it reminded them of the ups and downs of 2,000 years of their history that led up to this moment. And it's all summarized in 300 words. Now, it's a little bit like when we pull out a photo album and take a look at a picture. And actually, I was doing this over Thanksgiving. I was kind of organizing about 20 years of digital pictures, and I would find a picture, and it would bring back all these stories and memories, like the time my youngest daughter got a rabbit, And we've had, the rabbit lasted a lot longer than we thought, almost 15 years. And so we have lots of adventures with the rabbit. But the problem is with the genealogies for us is that we don't know the names and the stories as well as they did. And it's a little bit like looking at somebody else's photo album. But when you understand the backstory, it makes the Christmas story that much more remarkable. And there are lots of ups and downs in the stories. Now, one bit of good news is I'm not going to read the genealogy to you this morning, but we are going to take a look at some of the important people and the events that set the stage for Christmas. Now, I'm going to jump around this morning, so if you want to grab a Bible or follow along, you can kind of track my progress. If you turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of things in there, and we are actually going to look at two little pieces of the genealogy. So if you look, Matthew 1:1, we're going to start at the very beginning of the Christmas story. Also, while you're turning there, I want to say hello to our friends online. Thank you for joining us. So Matthew 1:1, and then I'm going to read verse 17. It says this: "This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham." And if you jump down to verse 17, it reads, "All those listed above include 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 from the Babylonian exile to the Messiah." Now, if this whole section is a summary of the Jewish history and really a summary of the Jewish scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament, verses 1 and 17 are a summary of the summary. And they summarize two things. They summarize two important people, David and Abraham. David was the kind of the starting of the line of kings, and then Abraham, who was the father of the Jewish nation that we'll see in a moment. But it's interesting, this word ancestors in Hebrew is the word Genesis, and it sounds very similar to, because it is, to a book, or the very first book of the Jewish scriptures, which is in our Old Testament, our Bible. And so David and Abraham were two of the most important figures. And then in verse 17, it highlights some of the events in the Jewish history, the events that included the birth of the nation through Abraham, to the coming of the kings, to the low point with the exile, and then eventually the coming of the Messiah. Now, one other thing I just want to mention about these genealogies, we love details and precision. In the ancient world, this wasn't nearly as important to them. So this is a real genealogy, but there may be some names missing. But one of the things that was much more important to them than to us is the numbers. And so, for instance, the number 14 is important because the number 7 is the number of God. And when things are repeated in the scriptures, it means to pay attention. And so the number 14 is telling us to pay attention to what you're about to read. So I mentioned that the word ancestors is the Hebrew word for Genesis. And the genesis of the birth of Jesus actually points us back to the very first book in our Bible. And so we're going to actually read in Genesis and hear about a story of a man named Abraham from Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. So again, the words will be on the screen if you want to just kind of follow along in the genealogy, if you want to just track progress. "The Lord said to Abram," God later named him Abraham, he said, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, or curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the families on earth will be blessed through you." Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now, God came to Abraham and he says, leave everything you've known, leave your native land, which meant the physical space where he lived, your relatives, your extended family, and your father's house, kind of his more immediate family, and the place that he lived. And he says, go to a place that I'll show you. Now, he didn't give Abraham direct clarity. He didn't say, here's the map. They didn't have ways to get there. And I'm sure as Abraham went back and told his wife and told the rest of his family that was going to be leaving with him, they probably thought he was a little crazy, because this was not an insignificant thing. And that day, if you didn't travel with your people and your tribe, your safety was in jeopardy, and they were your protection. And then God makes this promise to him, and I'm envisioning him telling Sarah this, and he says, God said he's going to make me into a great nation, but there's a problem. Abraham's 75 years old. He and his wife have no kids, and he's probably wondering, how is this possible? And she's wondering that as well. But God says, I'm going to bless you and make you famous. And I think that he probably wondered, how am I going to become famous when I'm walking away from everyone and everything that I've known, from the safety of my family, and are they even going to remember who I am years from now? But God makes him this promise. He says, I will be a blessing to you. God says, I will be involved in your life along the way. But the blessing's not just for Abraham, it's for others as well. He says, all families and tribes will be blessed through you. Well, this also probably sounded a little strange to Abraham, because that's not the way the world worked back in this day. Tribes didn't bless other tribes. They tended to attack and conquer and enslave. The world was a brutal place. But Abraham believes the unbelievable, the promises and the call of God, and he sets out on this journey. Now, it's interesting to note that there's some indication in the verses before that either God may have called Abraham's dad, or maybe he had called Abraham and they left part of the journey and then something stopped them on the way. But for whatever reason, Abraham answers the call and begins to follow where God leads him. Well, the story of Abraham is not a linear or simple story. It's a bit messy and complicated. Abraham's not always a model citizen. For instance, he lies about his wife several times, says she's his sister, creates problems for him, for her, for the people around him. He also tries to help God fulfill his promise by taking on a second wife, which we learn creates some other problems. And then you begin to wonder, is this really the guy that's going to bring blessing to the world? But in spite of all his faults, Abraham trusted God. And eventually he and his wife do have a boy. God keeps his promise. Now, Abraham's line continues, and he has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has a son, actually has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob steals the birthright from his older brother. Jacob ends up having 12 kids from 4 wives, a very complicated family situation, a lot of unhealthy dynamics, and this continues kind of throughout the story as the Jews often are vying for power. In fact, it gets so complicated that one of the youngest sons, Joseph, who gets on his brother's nerves, they're planning to kill him. They eventually end up selling him into slavery in Egypt. But it probably should make us all feel a little bit better if we have complicated family dynamics, that our families aren't quite that complicated. But the ups and downs in this story continue. There's an up as Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he has this rags to riches experience where he's in prison, but then he gets elevated to the second highest position in the land. Eventually, his family moves there. And then the story takes a downturn as over the years, their family is oppressed immigrants. They're eventually enslaved. And then in the genealogy, around probably verse 4, a guy named Moses shows up upon the scene, and he rescues the Jews. Now, if we're honest, this really wasn't a blessing for the Egyptians. It wasn't a blessing for the Canaanites, whose land that the Jews eventually moved into. There's lots of killing, and there's not a whole lot of blessing in the story. But again, ancient people had a different perspective and a different view of human life than we do. We have a perspective that's on this side of Christmas, where things are a little changed. But the ups and the downs continue in the story. There's a downturn because they don't listen or trust God as they leave Egypt and go to this land that God had promised Abraham. But finally, around verse 5 in the genealogy, they end up in the land that God had promised Abraham. And it's only taken about 1,000 years. It's a little slow. Then about a third of the way through the genealogy, we get to this man that's mentioned at the beginning named David. And David becomes a king, and he unites these 12 tribes together. And he's a great warrior, and because Israel's feared around the land, he brings peace and he brings security. And God repeats some of the blessings that he made to Abraham. And we get kind of a summary of the blessings from 1 Chronicles 17, where God says to David, I've been with you wherever you've gone. I will make your name famous. I will raise up one of your descendants, one of your sons, and I will make his kingdom strong. I will confirm him as king over my house and my kingdom for all time, and his throne will be secure forever. Again, David was far from perfect, but he trusted God. And so we have this up moment where his son Solomon becomes king. Solomon started really well. He starts by asking God for wisdom, and God promises to bless him as Solomon continues to follow him. And so he leads the Jewish nation, the Israelites, to their peak. He builds a temple for God. The people become rich and prosperous. And you think this is it. This is the fulfillment of God's promise. They've become a great nation, and they're ready to be a blessing to the world. But then the story takes another downturn. As Solomon begins to trust himself instead of God, and he starts to focus his blessings instead of on others, on himself. For instance, Solomon takes hundreds of wives, including wives from foreign nations, and he begins to worship their foreign gods. Now, after Solomon's death, the fighting begins, and the briefly united kingdom starts to splinter. In fact, they splinter into two kingdoms. A northern kingdom that eventually became Samaria that quickly forgot and stopped following God. The southern kingdom was a little bit more faithful. It was in the line of David, and his sons continued to rule there. And again, there's a whole bunch of ups and downs through the story. And so there are downs, like in verse 9 in the genealogy, the name Ahaz is mentioned. And Ahaz was a terrible king. He worshiped pagan gods, even sacrificed his own son as a sacrifice to one of these gods. But then there's moments where the story turns up again, where there's a young king named Joash who becomes king at the age of 8, and he rebuilds the temple or restores the temple and discovers the scriptures and begins to follow God's law. But at the end of Josiah, at the end of Josiah's life, invaders come into the land, the Egyptians and the Assyrians, and they begin to conquer, and the nation enters about 300 years of chaos. And you begin to think, it's game over, the dream is dead. What happened to the promises of God? But even in the midst of the ups and downs, God is still speaking to his people, and he's reminding them that he is still up to something, that the dream isn't dead, that his promise is still alive. And so he says this through the prophet Isaiah. He says, "You will do more than restore the people of Israel to me. I will make you a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth." And then later he speaks to the prophet Malachi, and he says, "My name will be great among the nations, from where the sun rises to where it sets, and every place incense and pure offerings will be brought to me, or every place pure offerings will be brought to me, because my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord Almighty." God continued to point to something that he's about to do, or really he's pointing to someone. But after Malachi, even God stopped speaking to the Jews. In fact, it's called the 400 years of silence, where there's no new prophets speaking on God's behalf. But even in the silence, there's eventually an upturn as the kingdom is sort of restored, as they rebuild the city and the temple, though it was destroyed, though it had previously been destroyed. And then the ultimate down moment for the Jewish nation. The Jews are fighting one another again, and one of the sides decides they want to reach out to Rome, which is generally not a good idea. The general Pompey decides to oblige. He invades the city of Jerusalem, and after months of sieging the city and the temple, he breaks through, and they slaughter 12,000 Jews. And Pompey, in his arrogance, walks up the steps to the Jewish temple. He walks into the Holy of Holies. And so you have a conquered people, a desecrated temple. They're not being a blessing to themselves, much less anybody else. And nobody's interested, especially in this day and age, when you have a God that can't even protect his own people. But sometimes when we think a dream or a promise is dead, it may actually be right around the corner. And God's timing isn't our timing. And even when he's silent, he's still at work. And part of the reason that this is an unlikely backstory is because behind the scenes, God is connecting unseen threads. He's at work. God is a promise keeper. Now, by now, we've moved to the end of this genealogy, and we've transitioned from the kings to some commoners. And in an unlikely moment, in the right time, the promise is fulfilled. Well, what was right about this moment? As devastating as the Roman occupation was, it brought several things to the known world of the day. First of all, it brought a common Roman and Greek culture. It brought a common language of Latin. And the Romans built roads, the best road system that ever existed. It extended from Great Britain to the Middle East and from Germany, what's now Germany, all the way down to North Africa. 50,000 miles of hard surface roads. And though the roads were built for military purposes, they also carried the news, including the good news that the world needed to hear. And that's when God sent his angel to fulfill the promise that he had made 2,000 years earlier. And the angel came to an unlikely peasant girl, possibly as young as 11 or 12, who lived in a small, insignificant village with a population smaller than 500. And this is where we read in the Gospel of Luke chapter 1 in verse 26, where it says, in the 6 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy, that was Mary's cousin, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a village in Galilee, to a virgin named Mary. She was engaged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of King David. Gabriel appeared to her and said, greetings, favored woman, the Lord is with you. Confused and disturbed, Mary tried to think what the angel could mean. Don't be afraid, Mary, the angel told her, for you have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over Israel forever. His kingdom will never end. Well, this promise to Mary sounded as crazy as the promise that had been made 2,000 years earlier to Abraham. Mary was a young girl. She was poor. She was a nobody. Her soon-to-be husband was a humble laborer. But like Abraham and David before her, she and eventually her soon-to-be husband Joseph believed God's words, and the world was changed forever. Excuse me, lost my place. Well, this Jewish God is now worshiped around the world by 2.5 billion people who identify as Christians. The world looks different on this side of Christmas because as Jesus' life, things that were considered defect in the ancient world, things like humility and forgiveness, are now considered virtues. Jesus raised the bar on what love looked like. He even called us to love our enemies. And he elevated the status of the poor, women, and children, 3 groups that were considered of lesser value in the ancient world. In fact, one thing to notice in that genealogy is that there were 4 women listed, which was unusual, and 3 of them were non-Jewish women. Because of the fulfillment of the promise, the world is a different place, and it's so significant that we even mark our calendars from Jesus' birth. Yes, the world needs Christmas. The world needs hope. And this hope is global. It's for the whole world, but it's also personal. And I can't help to come into this time of year and thinking about Christmas and remembering 5 years ago when we opened this building and this place and this story brought hope to a man who walked into the building the week of Christmas Eve. It was interesting because I'd just gotten out of a staff meeting where I told my staff, look, if somebody comes in and walks in and they need to talk to somebody, don't be afraid to interrupt me and we'll shut the meeting down and I'll stop and talk to them. No joke, 15 to 20 minutes later, there's a knock on my door. I'm in the meeting with another staff member, and I've got a staff member who opens the door and says, somebody is here to see you. They just walked in. This guy had walked in. He was a former addict. He'd been sober for 4 months, but there was something inside of him that he knew that if he didn't get something deeper than his recovery journey, that it wasn't going to stick. And he was desperate, and he'd been driving by this church for weeks, trying to summon up the courage to walk in the doors. And somebody had told him about Grace Fishers. And so on this particular day, he decided to walk in. His name is Patrick, and his life has been changed forever from that moment when he took the step to walk in the doors. As he began to discover the Christmas story, he came to Christmas Eve services later that week and heard the story afresh. He hadn't been in church since he was a boy, and his life is forever changed. In fact, Patrick today, for the first time, is sharing his story in a church in Ohio. The world needs Christmas, and so do we. Now, looking back on this story years later, the Apostle Paul put it this way. He said this, "But when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children." The world needs Christmas. The world needs hope. And so do we.